The Department of Agriculture's fiscal year 24 budget request. Secretary Vilsack, I want to welcome you, and I look forward to hearing more about your priorities for the coming year, as well as having a discussion on other important issues under the jurisdiction of this subcommittee. USDA's fiscal year 24 budget request totaled $24.46 billion, an increase of $2.5 billion, or 11.5% over last year's levels. Mr. Secretary, I'm sure it isn't news to you that the fiscal situation this country is facing is nothing short of dire. Unfortunately, the budget request you put forward is unrealistic and unattainable. We simply can't afford what you have proposed. I believe we need to have an honest discussion about USDA's priorities and where our constituents' hard-earned taxpayer dollars make the greatest impact. USDA has received over $200 billion through the many supplemental funding packages, including the American Rescue Plan, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Despite the enormous amounts of resources provided to the Department through congressional action, you've unilaterally increased SNAP benefits by more than $250 billion through a quick, politically driven update of the Thrifty Food Plan, which is the underlying market basket of foods used to establish SNAP benefit amounts. You've treated the Commodity Credit Corporation like a slush fund to advance political priorities not directed by Congress. In 2022, you spent $6.6 billion on programs not authorized in the Farm Bill or other legislation, including $3.5 billion on climate and $1.5 billion on school nutrition programs, which was pushed out after Congress provided the Department specific direction to increase school meal reimbursement rates through the Keep Kids Fed Act, not to spend more funds from the CCC. All of this came on top of the $2.5 billion you spent in 2021 on unauthorized programs. This reckless, unauthorized use of taxpayer dollars in CCC deserves scrutiny in today's hearing and calls into question whether this administration can be trusted with any discretionary authority under the Corporations Charter Act in future fiscal years. On the regulatory front, I'm disappointed that the Department has renewed its Obama-era efforts under the Packers and Stockyards Act to dictate how poultry and livestock producers raise and market their animals. Poultry and livestock market structures are both complex and efficient and ultimately reward high-performing producers who meet consumer demands. A top-down regulatory approach attempting to fundamentally change these production and marketing practices risks harming growers, processors, and consumers alike, and to drive these important food industries offshore. I was very interested to see that your budget request includes the hiring of 4,700 new full-time employees. For the past several fiscal years, this subcommittee has provided record-high funding level for USDA's 3 field agencies, Rural Development, the Farm Service Agency, and the National Resources Conservation Service. And yet, USDA continues to claim to be severely understaffed. I'm interested in how USDA chose to allocate past funding, as well as your plans for these new hires. It seems to me that in this year's proposal, you've prioritized bloating the bureaucracy, focusing on staffing up your Washington, D.C. headquarters, rather than hiring field office staff to serve and support our nation's producers and to deliver on USDA's core mission. This subcommittee will not prioritize climate change, equity, or green initiatives over mission-critical services to our farmers. I remain concerned about this administration's focus when it comes to domestic nutrition programs. As steward of taxpayer dollars, we have an obligation to scrutinize mandatory funding when it goes beyond what Congress has authorized and intended. The USDA has consistently sought to expand eligibility, loosen work requirements, and increase benefits. As COVID waivers and increased benefits expire, and the unemployment rate remains, thankfully, at a record low, we would have expected to see participation rates decline more rapidly. However, your fiscal year 24 budget request for SNAP is more than $15 billion over pre-pandemic levels, a staggering 79.9% increase over those pre-pandemic levels. This is something the subcommittee will be looking at very closely. Finally, I'd like to applaud the Department's response to the highly pathogenic avian influenza. As the United States faces the worst outbreak in our history, it's critical to continue working to mitigate the spread of the disease and assist those producers whose flock have become affected. Again, I appreciate you being with us, Mr. Secretary, and I look forward to today's discussion. Ranking Member Bishop, I will now yield to you for any opening remarks you would like to make.
Thank you very much, Chairman Harris. Secretary Vilsack, I welcome you, and let me start off by thanking you and congratulating you and the people over at USDA for all that you have done over the past few years to get us through the pandemic, supporting our farmers, our ranchers, rural America, supporting Americans in our nutrition programs, and of course, helping us as we try to build for a better America and recover from what we've been through. Secretary Vilsack, you've identified in several letters the potential harms of some of the concerns and the cuts that have been recommended by the other side to cut domestic discretionary spending. One of the plans wants to revert back to the FY22 levels, and others are saying just reduce it by 22% or more. You sent an excellent letter, which is available on the Appropriations Democrats website, which identified the devastating impacts on WIC, the Food Safety and Inspection Service, rural rental assistance, conservation operations, technical assistance that is provided to our producers, and the Farm Service Agency loans to farmers. The full committee ranking member and I will, I'm sure, explore the impact of these cuts during the question and answer period. At a time when it's possible that your 2024 request will be sharply attacked in the House bill, I think that members need to think about what could be lost under that scenario. Notable investments in the requests that virtually every member of the subcommittee supports include an increase of $105 million to help secure our watersheds, 400 more staff in rural development, increasing the funding for single-family housing loans, an increase in the Guaranteed Business and Industry Loan Program, an increase in water and waste funding that's desperately needed by so many rural communities across America, $52 million for the Reconnect program, $550 million for the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative, better known as AFRI. While we hear some support for drastic cuts, I don't think we will hear much criticism of increases such as these in the budget. To my friends on the other side of the aisle, you can't have it both ways. Either these or the many other programs in our bill are worthy, or they should be funded at the necessary level to do their jobs for the American people, or they are not. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to hearing from the Secretary. I've heard criticisms of the Commodity Credit Corporation spending, and I certainly would like to invite the Secretary to talk about his perception that somehow that fund has been misused or overused. I believe that it was an available tool that Congress put in place many, many years ago, and it has served its purpose in helping the American people, our farmers, our ranchers, to get through these terrible times that we've experienced over the past 2 or 3 years. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back, and I look forward to testimony from the Secretary and the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bishop. Secretary Vilsack, without objection, your entire written testimony will be included in the record. I'll now recognize you for your statement, and then we'll proceed with questions. I'll note we are supposed to have votes at 10:30 to 10:45, so there'll be 5 minutes of questioning, and I'll use the gavel a little more than I have in the past because I'd like to complete this before we go to the floor so that we're not holding up the Secretary any more than we have to. Secretary Vilsack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Bishop and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning. You know, I have 5 minutes, and it's very difficult to talk about all the issues before this committee in 5 minutes, so I'm just going to focus on one specific issue, which has to do with farm income. In the last 2 years, we have actually recognized a record farm income. Net cash farm income is at record levels, never higher than it has been in the last 2 years. The challenge for us and for you is to recognize the pivotal moment that we're in. Because during that record year, nearly 50% of our farmers did not make any money. Another 40% of our farmers made money, but the majority of money they made came from off-farm income. So what we have is a circumstance where a significant percentage of large, very, very large farms have done quite well. but about 90% of our farms, which are small and mid-sized, continue to be challenged. This is not a new problem. If you go back to 1979 and the statements of then Secretary Bob Berglund, you will see that he raised this issue. If you go back to the report of Isaac Newton, not the Isaac Newton of fame, but the Isaac Newton who was the first Commissioner of Agriculture, who issued a report to Abraham Lincoln in 1863, he noted the concerns about consolidation in size. And what we have is a circumstance and situation where I think we are challenged to figure out ways in which we can create new income opportunities for that 90%. That it can't just be the sale of commodities, the sale of crops and livestock and government payments. It has to be entrepreneurial opportunities within these farm units. And that's one of the reasons why it's important to have the tools that we have, and the reason why we have used these tools in a way to create new opportunities, new avenues, new markets, better markets, more consistent markets. And so that's the reason, and I'm happy to talk to you about the legal justification for the use of the CCC, which, by the way, when we set up the Climate Smart Commodity Program to establish climate smart commodities, which is well within the purview of the CCC, we did so at the request of 80 organizations, Farm Bureau, National Farmers Union, a variety of commodity groups, who indicated a desire to have this fund set up and suggested that we use $50 billion from the CCC. We put $1 billion out. We received 1,000 applications, Mr. Chairman, and of those 1,000 applications, we attempted to fund 141. These are extraordinary partnerships between farm groups, between conservation groups, environmental groups, universities, major food companies, significant retailers, all of which are designed to create a new market opportunity, a higher value proposition for small and mid-sized producers. We're going to learn a lot from these opportunities, and as we do, the resources under the Inflation Reduction Act can then be targeted and used in a way that will help to create new revenue streams and sources for our farmers. We use the American Rescue Plan resources to create a stronger local and regional food system. We know from the pandemic that our system, as efficient as it is, frankly, was not resilient. And this is building resilience. We're expanding competition. We're building more processing facilities with those American Rescue Plan resources. We're helping to create more farm to school and more local connections between producers and those who purchase at a local level. So I'm happy to talk to you about all of this. I look forward to it. But I think the challenge here is to recognize the transformational and pivotal moment. The budget is important, the Farm Bill is important, the CCC is important, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the American Rescue Plan. All of these tools are necessary and important to be able to begin to craft new and better market opportunities for our farmers. In doing so, we will create not only additional revenue opportunities and income for farmers, we'll also strengthen our rural communities. By strengthening our rural communities, we'll give farmers the ability to do what every farmer that I know, that I've ever talked to, wants to do, which is to pass that farm on to the next generation. And I know that there are a lot of young people that would love to have the opportunity to live, work, and raise their families in small communities, but they have to have opportunity. And that's what this budget, that's what our utilization of the CCC and other resources is designed to do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, and I'll start the question. And so let me follow up on the Commodity Credit Corporation. Look, it's great that 80 groups, got together and talked you into doing this initiative. But 80 groups is not what the Constitution says, is who establishes how we spend dollars and what we do. Shame on us for allowing that discretionary authority. I mean, again, my understanding is you didn't have the discretionary authority was removed between 2012 and 2017. My opinion, it probably should be removed again, because I think that's abusive. Congress is in session 12 months of the year. If you thought this was such an important program, in my opinion, you should have come to Congress and asked to spend on it. I wouldn't have agreed to it. I don't think, and maybe we would have. I just think the program was abused. 80 groups, 80 special interest groups do not run the policy of this country. And that's all I can say. Congress runs the policy.
Mr. Chairman.
And Congress will speak again on this issue.
They may very well, but the reality is when they established the Commodity Credit Corporation, they gave the capacity of the department. If you remember the history of this, it is designed to respond to challenges that are faced in agriculture, and climate's a challenge. Whether you want to agree to it or not, it is a challenge, and these farm groups understand that. And the reality is, under the Commodity Credit Corporation's charter,
Mr.
we have
Secretary,
every
again,
right to do what we did.
Reclaiming my time. Mr. Secretary, I get it. We put in a loophole that you used. I get it. It's
not a
Shame
loophole.
on us.
It's
Mr.
in
Secretary,
the charter.
reclaiming my time. There was no question mark at the end of that. No question mark, okay? Let's talk about your departmental priorities. In the press release on the FY24 budget, you promote in order. Farmers aren't the first. Farmers and our producers aren't first. The initiatives set forth by the White House Hunger Conference, climate change, equity, creating more and better markets for agricultural products, and making USDA, quote, a great place to work. I would suggest that your priorities ought to be our farmers and producers, not the initiatives set forth by the White House Hunger Conference. I get it. Look, I get it. Everybody wants to spend more money on everything. And that's what the White House Hunger Conference conclusion was. Climate change, equity. All I can say is I don't think you have the right priorities. Can you tell us where USDA's core mission of delivering mission-critical services, such as field operations at Rural Development, Farm Service Agency, and the NRSC, falls within your list of priorities? Because they weren't on that list.
Every single one of those things that you listed impacts and affects farmers, Mr. Chairman. It does.
I'll tell you what impacts my farmers. What impacts my farmers, whether or not we have an adequate crop insurance program, whether we're controlling the cost of their inputs, whether we're setting, which we'll talk a little bit about more, new GIPSA rules, which will drive these industries offshore. You may disagree with that, Mr. Secretary,
Farmers
and we
are
can
asking
disagree
for
with
this.
that.
Farmers are asking for the rules, Mr. Chairman. And the reality is, one of the reasons we are able to respond to the high path.
There is no question mark at the end.
Well,
I'll tell you what. Let's make a deal. I'll say the word question mark when it's your turn to answer a question.
No, that's not correct. You can't, because I'm not going to let you make comments and challenge what we're doing
so
at
you're
USDA.
reclaiming my time. This is my time. You had 5 minutes. Now I'm going to give myself additional time because you've been using my time. You had time, Mr. Secretary. This is my time.
I'm responding to your comments, Mr. Chairman. I don't think they're
How
fair.
about responding to my questions?
Well, ask a question.
Mr. Secretary, you have the Constitution of the United States backwards. Article 1 is the legislative branch. Article 2 is the executive branch. The executive branch is responsible to the legislative branch, not the other way around.
I don't see
Thank
it that
you.
way. Separation of powers. We're equal in our democracy, Mr. Chairman.
Let's talk about this. Let's talk about the SNAP program.
Happy to.
Your department actually sets dietary guidelines, don't they? You're in concert with HHS.
Yes.
Question mark. That right? You do. And your dietary guidelines speak to, for instance, the need for a diet that will result in lower obesity, less hypertension, less sodium, things like that. Are there any efforts in the SNAP program to restrict what can be purchased on that program to allow for perhaps educating the American public about what constitutes bad food or good food, like the WIC program does, which you also oversee?
We basically have an education and education component of SNAP that does just that. We also provide incentives for healthy choices.
What percent of the SNAP budget, the SNAP program payments or utilization of the dollars comes, for instance, for sugary soft drinks?
I don't know the exact percentage.
Do you think that would be something that would be important to know if our goal is to actually decrease the amount of added sugar in Americans' diets, and this is the largest supplemental nutrition program that the government runs?
I think that there are many challenges with that notion, and I think it's important to understand what we're not trying to do is to stigmatize people that are struggling financially. We're talking about senior citizens, people with disabilities. You know, that's a challenge. It's a challenge from a technology standpoint, and it's a challenge in terms of stigma. I think what we're trying to do is make sure that people understand that they have the capacity, and we want to give them additional resources and incentives to make the right choices. We want to trust the consumer.
So we're going to trust the consumer on that, but we're going to issue dietary guidelines, right? So your department says we're going to need dietary guidelines to kind of tell industry, because we don't trust the consumer to read a label. We might come down the path where we're going to insist on decreased sodium, but we trust them on the SNAP program. Well, Mr. Secretary, I've got to tell you, to me, this is a huge area of opportunity to improve the nutrition of Americans and to do it through the SNAP program. Mr. Bishop?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here, and I appreciate very much your willingness to answer the questions and to present how you are implementing the statutory and constitutional responsibilities of the Department of Agriculture. So if you would like to elaborate on some of the answers, the comments that you were about to make, you may take a couple of moments of my time to do that.
Well, I think it's important to understand that the Commodity Credit Corporation was established at a time of great crisis in this country, and it was established to provide flexibility to the department to be able to respond to challenges. We have a challenge both in terms of climate and in terms of the inequity and distribution of profit and income within the agricultural economy. We can't have 90% of our producers not making money or not making the majority of their money from farming operations. So how are you going to do that? What are you going to do for those 90%? One way you can help them is by creating a more value-added proposition, creating a different market, a new commodity. And that's essentially what USDA did, and it's essentially what the charter of the Commodity Credit Corporation provides for.
Is that what the industry was asking for, the
industry,
farmers?
Every major commodity group was begging for this.
These are the people who produce our food and fiber?
Correct. They're not special interests, in my view. They're the people we represent and work for.
Well, Mr. Secretary, there have been proposals put out, and you've heard some of that today, that there's overspending and that this budget is bloated, that the president has submitted. And they want to go back to FY22 levels or possibly just cut across the board 22%. Would you just share with the committee and with the American public some of the impacts that those proposed cuts, going back to FY22, reducing it 22%. For example, at the food safety and inspection services, how will that impact the safety of the Americans' food? And the food that we eat and that housewives and families get from the grocery store? How will it impact rural development and rural America all across this country? How will it affect conservation? And tell us about what happens if we don't look at the impact of climate on our producers, as well as our national security.
Well, let's talk about the range of impacts that the cuts might result in. Take NRCS, for example. If you essentially provide the range of cuts that have been proposed, you're essentially looking at 84,000 producers not being able to access the technical assistance that they need to do the conservation work that they want to do and to take advantage of the conservation programs we have. If you talk about food safety, you're talking about literally thousands of food inspectors that we would not be able to continue to have, which would have an impact not only on existing processing facilities, but would significantly cripple our ability to expand competition and provide better prices for farmers. If you're talking about rural development, you're talking about rental assistance, and you're talking about nearly 40,000 people losing the opportunity to have the rental assistance that allows them to have a decent home. So, I mean, the reality is that there would be real consequences to these cuts.
What about nutrition?
Well, on the nutrition side, it would make it difficult for us to provide WIC benefits for somewhere between 250,000 participants on a monthly basis to over 1 million. So, I mean, it would have real consequences to real people.
My time is almost expired, Mr. Secretary, but you've got a lot of challenges that you face at the department, and I want to commend you for your vision and for the positive efforts and strides that you are making to try to address these challenges. Our farmers have gotten through a very, very, very difficult time over the last 3 years, and it's because of the help and our rural communities, of the help that they've gotten through the programs that you've been able to finance partially from the CCC and other things that were authorized within the appropriations and the other pieces of legislation that this Congress passed. So I want to commend you for that, and I'll follow up with additional questions in the next round.
Mr. Molinar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. And first, let me just say, I want to compliment my Democratic friends. They have very well-prepared talking points on these kind of an artificial proposal on cuts, and I see that, you know, there's kind of a collaboration with the administration on this as well. But let me talk about a real budget issue, a real spending issue that I think we could actually really do some good in a bipartisan way. And that is that the estimates of the unspent, unobligated funds left over from the American Rescue Plan that was designed to be spent during the COVID emergency. And they're in different agencies in the federal government. The president and everyone pretty much agrees that we no longer have a health emergency. And estimates show anywhere between $70 billion and $90 billion of unobligated spending. And my thought is, and I think it could be a very bipartisan thing, that should go towards debt reduction, not spending these dollars, wasting them under an emergency that no longer exists. I'm wondering if you could comment on the amount of funding your department, your agency has in unobligated COVID spending.
We have very little. I don't know where the $70 billion number comes from.
Well, it comes from the, just to clarify, the Committee for the Responsible Federal Budget.
Okay, but that, in terms of the departments, I don't know how it's spread among departments. But we have very little unobligated funds because we have focused our resources on our major resource. We didn't get a tremendous amount from the American Rescue Plan compared to other departments, but the resources that we did get, we are using to create that more resilient food system. While the healthcare crisis per se is resolved, the resiliency of our food system still remains and requires investment. But we'll be happy to get you the specific number after this hearing.
Yeah, I would appreciate that, because when I think of unobligated funds that were designed during a health emergency, you know, there are certainly other competing priorities that we'd want to spend those dollars on or use it for deficit reduction. And so I'd appreciate that. Thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit about rural broadband. That's a huge issue in my district. The Connect program, you know, one of the concerns that's been raised is that there's a goal of helping communities, helping regions who don't have, you know, top-notch service, maybe increase that to a better level. And I think that's a worthy goal. But at the same time, there's so many areas that don't have really access at all. And I'm just wondering how you, as a department, look at that, how we can make sure that people who don't have access to the internet as a higher priority than maybe expanding improving the current.
When Congress passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, they basically directed $65 billion to the issue of broadband access. The resources they provided the Department of Agriculture, about $1.9 billion, were specifically directed to what are called unserved and underserved areas as it relates to the speed of upload and download speeds. So our resources have been specifically directed by Congress to focus on increasing capacity so that more than one person in a family can downstream, can stream something at the same time. So folks don't have to go to the McDonald's parking lot to get their kids' homework, that thing. The Commerce Department and the FCC are responsible for the $63 billion in that infrastructure law, and that resource is designed to address the problem that you've raised. And before you can do that, you actually have to have maps. You have to know exactly where the unserved areas are, and those resources are going to be funneled through the state governments because the state governments are on the ground. They know their states better than we'll ever know them. And hopefully they will get those resources allocated very quickly to resolve the problem that you have mentioned.
Okay, thank you. And just a couple of quick questions on the transitional standards, I guess it'd be the dietary standards, the alternatives for the milk standard. The word alternative, do you mean options, or do you mean the proposal aims to include plant-based beverages as milk?
There are options in terms of the amount of what we serve and who we serve it to. There are options. It's not about alternatives as you described
Okay.
it.
And then both of your proposed options don't remove flavored milk entirely from grades K to 12. Is that correct?
That's correct, and I think you're going to see the dairy industry sort of coalesce around a single option, which would be helpful.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Pingree.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us. Thank you for your talk. You know, you've had the opportunity to have this position twice, and thank you for serving. And I know you're experienced and tough, and you don't need anyone to defend you, but I do want to say, I know there's going to be some criticism of you today, and there already has been, but I just want to tell you how much I appreciate how you handled the USDA during the pandemic. The things you're talking to us about today are so beneficial to the farmers that I talk to, the fact that you make your primary focus on the income of our farmers. I think we should all be shocked and dismayed, the idea that 10% of the farmers in this country are the ones who are making money off the farm. Virtually every farmer I know works off the farm, or as a family member works off the farm. And the ideas that are coming through with your use of the Commodity Credit Corporation, the proposals that I've seen, the groups that I've met with that are already working across the country to diversify these income streams, to do the very things that you're saying, I just think are so critically important. It's a visionary idea, it's thoughtful, it deals with the challenges. You know, we can talk about climate change, but to a farmer, it's bizarre weather. In my state, it's too much rain in June and drought later in the summer, and people have to change their whole farming practices to deal with this. And what you're thinking about is how we deal with that adverse weather, how farmers deal with this lack of income. I'm just really grateful for the way you've been creative about that. Grateful for what we learned during the supply chain challenges of the pandemic crisis, and understanding that we need to strengthen our local food processing. We need to do more for our local communities. I have a lot of small to medium-sized farmers in my state, and they need to see more slaughterhouses. They need to see more of the things you're talking about. I really appreciate the rules you're putting forward on competition. If people didn't learn that we have too few people in the meat and poultry processing industries, they weren't paying attention, and the USDA rules, I think, are really important in competition, and we need to continue that very, very critical step. I also think understanding the challenges people went through during the pandemic, needing, with hunger, needing more food bank availability, but really needing SNAP benefits. And I can't imagine, I just don't even understand why in the wealthiest country in the nation, we would have a single debate about food. Why would we ever talk about availability of food? Why would we argue and say that people can live and feed their families on $6 per person per day? It's more than a lot of people pay for their morning coffee. So to be even debating that, or trying to make it more restrictive, trying to keep more people from accessing those programs, I think is unthinkable, it's immoral, it's not the way we should think in this country, and we're gonna have that debate. It's gonna be a huge debate in the Farm Bill, and I'm sorry that people have to see us do that. So thank you. I'm just saying, I think you and the department are working hard with not enough people. We know we need more boots on the ground for our conservation programs, for NRCS, all these things. We need to give you more tools to work with, and I appreciate what you've done. I will just quickly talk about an issue that you know I'm going to bring up, and that is PFAS contamination. Other people may not have experienced this in their state, but Maine is a leader in understanding that this is contaminating much of our farmland. It's in our drinking water, and I know you've been working closely with people on this. I wanted to bring up one of my constituents, Adam. He and his family have been terribly impacted by PFAS contamination in their farm in Unity, Maine. Their soil, their crops, their drinking water, they're all contaminated. This is a family who's been working on their farm for a long time, improving the soil, everything else, but their children and they themselves have levels of PFAS in their bodies that are at 99%. We have been working on legislation around this. We put $5 million in the bill last year for the USDA to address PFAS contamination. This year's request is $20 million, so you've got a minute and 18 seconds. But I know you're committed to working on this. How do you think we're going to be able to spend the first $5, and where do you see us starting on this huge challenge?
I think the first thing is to understand what the extent of the challenge we face. So that's going to require an assessment. NRCS needs to be able to provide that assessment. We need research in terms of determining what levels are acceptable in terms of animals, in terms of crops, in terms of people. And that, in turn, will allow us to determine whether or not and how we would indemnify or protect folks who have been impacted negatively by PFAS. I don't think we know the full extent of this yet. I'd like to think it's limited to Maine, Michigan, and New Mexico, but I'm concerned that it's not. And so we're going to focus these resources on trying to get an assessment of the overall challenge. We're going to take a look at creative ways in which we might be able to address problems with contaminated land. It could be the opportunity for CRP to be used. So it really requires assessment, evaluation, research, creating a measure and appropriate standards for what's acceptable, and then figuring out how we might be able to help farmers who have been negatively impacted by this.
Well, thank you for both visiting my state, talking to the farmers, and being willing to talk about this. I, too, hope that it's confined to just a few states, but certainly other states can learn from our example. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Bishop. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being with us this morning. I want to say that in my time as serving as director of my Department of Agriculture in the state of Washington, and my tenure here as a member of Congress, I've appreciated the understanding of the challenges of rural America that you have brought to the agency. And even though we might not always agree on every single issue, but I appreciate your dedication to improving the lives of our agricultural producers. I'm someone that one of my priorities has been a stable and legal workforce for American agriculture. Still working on that. But I want to make sure we see that through. So I have a question about I think it's called the Farm Stabilization and Protection Pilot Grant Program. Could you clarify for me the goals and intent of that program? I've seen the website. It talks about driving U.S. economic recovery, reducing migration, expanding legal pathways, improving working conditions for farm workers. But out of curiosity, tell me what the American farmer and rancher is getting for the $65 million investment. And tell me a little bit about the process. Has the Department of Labor have you engaged with them regularly in putting together this pilot program? And how much, if any, of the $65 million has been spent?
Very little of the $65 million has been spent, Congressman. What we're really trying to do is to show what the Farm Worker Modernization Act would actually be like if it were passed by both the House and the Senate. The reality is that we need a stable workforce, as you well know, and this would essentially be a pilot that would say this is how it would work. You essentially establish folks who are interested in being farm workers who may not live here at this point in time. You basically train them. You make sure that they are prepared to do the job that's necessary. You link them up with a farming operation that needs workers. You explain the circumstances and conditions, working conditions and pay and so forth that they would be working under. And then you essentially link those workers with the farmer who needs the workers. And you evaluate how well they do. And you provide them certainty so they can go back to their home country after the work is done. So it essentially shows how the Farm Worker Modernization Act could work. It is really, in my view, an unfortunate circumstance that the Senate did not pass that bill, because farmers now are confronted with a very significant increase in wage levels because of the H-2A program, which would have been avoided had that law passed.
People are probably thinking that we talked before this hearing. We did not, but I appreciate the effort there, and would be certainly look forward to seeing progress and learning more about what you're doing there.
You should see something later this spring, Congressman, and I will make sure that our team apprises you of it as it's unfolding.
Thank you. Something else, it's an area, I think someone else touched on it already, but earlier this year, including myself, a bipartisan group of members sent you a letter concerning U.S. farmland purchases by foreign entities, referenced an AgriPulse story that stated that the USDA did not assess penalties for misreporting land purchases. Got your reply yesterday, so I appreciate that. I'm not sure our questions were entirely answered specifically, so I just wanted to ask a little bit more about that today. Sure. Will you pursue applying retroactive FEDA enforcement penalties for the period of 2015 to 2018?
We have the power to do that, and we've doubled the workforce focused on this issue with the express purpose of taking a look at where we might be able to assess those penalties. I think the challenge is finding the right balance between the level of penalty that encourages folks to report. As you know, we have no investigative report capacity under the law. All we are able to do is to receive information that is voluntarily submitted to us. And that's a real challenge because you've got over 3,000 county recorders' offices around the country. On any given day, somebody's walking into those recorders' offices and is filing a deed. So we need to think about a process or a system that gives us better input information that would allow us to do a better job of enforcing that particular law. But we are anxious to take a look at retroactive and determine whether or not penalties need to be assessed, and if so, what the appropriate level is. We don't want with the penalties to assess them at a level that would discourage and encourage people to try not to report.
Well, we look forward to working with you to see what we can do to give you the tools you absolutely need so that we have a handle on this entire issue. But appreciate you being here. Gone over my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Underwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Vilsack, thanks for being here with us. It's good to see you again, sir. As you know, I'm the co-founder and co-chair of the Black Maternal Health Caucus, and I want to take this opportunity to highlight how vital the WIC program is to addressing the Black maternal health crisis and building healthier outcomes for Black mothers and their families. Republican leaders have proposed devastating cuts to WIC as part of other negotiations, leading to between 250,000 to 1.5 million moms and babies losing life-saving help to keep their bellies full. I believe in putting people over politics, and I reject these proposed cuts. And I understand how critical it is that funding for the WIC program keep pace with increasing enrollment. The Biden administration's budget invests in the WIC program so that it can better serve moms and kids. This funding will account for rising enrollment as families face additional needs and continue the enhanced cash value benefit for fruits and vegetables to give them healthier options. The Biden administration's request also supports the long-awaited update of the WIC food packages to better align with current nutrition science. Secretary Vilsack, can you detail for us how these updates and enhancements to the WIC food package will benefit families and how cuts to WIC funding could devastate this progress?
It provides additional resources for the purchase of fruits and vegetables, which we know are healthy choices for moms and for children. It also allows us to continue the modernization effort that we have underway at WIC, where we're essentially trying to make it a little bit easier for folks to certify as a WIC provider. We're trying to make it a little bit easier for folks to actually redeem their WIC benefits by providing online opportunities for both ordering and delivery of those products. And of course, as you know, we're in the process of analyzing the 30,000 or so comments that we got on the WIC package to be able to finalize that process hopefully sometime this year.
I hope my fellow subcommittee members agree with me that we have to protect and increase funding for the WIC program. We cannot allow hundreds of thousands or potentially even millions of moms and kids to be kicked off of WIC and pushed into waiting lists. This would be unconscionable, especially during this time of higher grocery prices, increased food insecurity, and a worsening maternal health crisis. I want to turn now to another issue affecting children within USDA's purview. Earlier this month at this subcommittee's hearing with the USDA Inspector General, I touched on the recent disturbing reports of illegal child labor, much of which has been occurring with migrant children in the food and agricultural sector. These reports included facilities inspected by USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service and owned by corporations with which the federal government contracts. I asked Inspector General Fong if her office was looking at the role that USDA does or could play in combating the use of illegal child labor in the food and agricultural sector. She responded that the OIG has been following recent reporting closely and that the issue of USDA's role here bears some further thought on the agency's part. So, Mr. Secretary, I'll now ask you, has USDA taken any steps to examine how it might work with the Department of Labor and Health and Human Services to do more to combat the use of illegal child labor, particularly in facilities or work sites where USDA has a presence?
I've had opportunities to have conversations with officials from the Department of Labor on this issue, and in fact, we're issuing today a letter to the industry to encourage them to be on the lookout for the contractors that they use in terms of cleaning and so forth, to make sure that they are fully aware of the nature of the contractors they're using to ensure that we are not supporting the illegal use of child labor.
Well, I hope that USDA will continue to examine this issue. You know, it seems to me that if we have a federal employee on a work site and it's clear that there is an illegal child labor engagement happening, that federal worker from your department would feel empowered to issue a report or referral. And I think some clear guidance from you to your staff would go a long way in giving our committee the confidence that the federal workforce is partnering with us to protect these vulnerable children. I've stated it previously that it's far past time that Congress act to strengthen child labor laws and protect vulnerable children from exploitive labor practices, but we have to do all that we can right now, right? Legislation takes time, sir, you know this, but we need an all-of-government approach to keep these kids safe, and that must include both USDA and this committee. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. The USDA has proposed several rules that disregard the Packers and Stockyards Act, a well-established precedent set in the 8 federal appellate circuits. I have major concerns from my constituents about these rules, which the department has promoted under its competition agenda, which you announced 2 years ago, were 3 rules that Congress has historically opposed. Why are these rules not being released altogether? Knowing how closely linked they are, it's nearly impossible to evaluate the impacts of them independently.
Well, it takes time to formulate them, and I think people are making assumptions about what these rules are or are not. I mean, let's take a look at what we've actually filed. We filed a rule that asks for greater transparency. We think producers ought to be able to know a little bit about who they're doing business with. They ought to know whether or not that integrator is financially solvent, and that's the reason why we put the transparency rule out. We also think that if there are circumstances where individuals have been retaliated against or discriminated against, that they ought to have a recourse under the Packers and Stockyards to be able to get some measure of justice. There'll be additional rules that we'll continue to be filing, but we're working on them, Congressman.
Okay. Well, years ago, similar rules were established that cost the U.S. chicken industry alone over $1.4 billion in the first few years of implementation. The department is now estimating these rules to cost pennies on the dollar. Why is your estimate so low, and why wasn't a thorough economic analysis included?
A thorough economic analysis has been included. It doesn't cost a great deal to ask people for greater transparency.
How could legal costs and potential lawsuits not be included in any of the cost estimates?
Well, I
Because you
don't
know
thi-
there it will be.
Actually, we have some of the major chicken processing companies agreeing to these provisions. Cargill recently in their merger agreed to embrace this, and I think we just recently had another major poultry processing company say, we're all for the transparency. We understand why you're asking for it.
Avian influenza is impacting the poultry industry in many parts of the country, and as a result, increasing prices Americans are paying at the grocery store for eggs. And how is USDA assisting poultry producers to ensure that they have the resources they need to respond to disease threats like avian influenza and recover their operations in the instance they must depopulate their flock?
We've allocated initially $800 million from the Commodity Credit Corporation. Those resources are being used first to aid in the detection of high-path avian influenza. Secondly, to be able to assist farmers in depopulating their flocks and disposing of them properly. And third, basically providing for cleanup services to contaminate the facilities, and then to provide some indemnity for the birds that have been lost so that farmers can get back in business as quickly as possible.
Many parts of my district, the 6th District of Virginia, are very rural, and do not have adequate broadband service, do not have any broadband service. So I want to follow up on Mr. Molinar's question. The current round 4 of Reconnect allows funding to go to areas that have broadband service below 120 to 20 speeds, but apparently you're supporting using Reconnect funding to increase speeds of existing networks instead of funding construction where no networks currently exist. Will you commit to us that unserved areas remain the top priority for Reconnect funding?
Unserved has an interesting definition in the connection of the Reconnect program. Unserved means facilities that are currently, like DSL. That is an area that has DSL is considered to be unserved because the download and upload speeds are fairly slow. The portion, and Congress has directed us to focus on those areas with the Reconnect program. It's the FCC and the Commerce Department that is responding to the unserved areas as you've defined it.
Okay.
And that's why they want to work with the states. That's why they need mapping. They need to know exactly what we're doing first so that they know where we're working,
Okay.
where there's service. So it's going to happen, sir. But it's not in our purview to do this. It's the Commerce Department and the FCC.
Thank you. I yield my remaining time to the chairman.
Thank you very much. A quick follow-up on the WIC, because there's no proposal I know of, specific proposal by the Republican conference to cut WIC. I don't know. I get the talking point. I understand the straw man argument. I get the whole thing. Let me ask you two very brief questions about WIC. What's the state copay on administrative costs, and what's the % of administrative costs of the entire program?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Can you get back to us?
Sure,
Do you know
absolutely.
is there a state cost share in WIC? Is there a state cost share in WIC at all?
I don't believe there is, but I could be wrong.
Okay, if you could get back to me, I appreciate that. Ms. Capter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really look forward to coming to this hearing and being able to welcome back Secretary Vilsack. I have great respect for your work. Thank you for all the effort you put forward for our country and certainly for our farmers. I love your focus on farm income. Where I come from, in the Great Lakes watershed, I share that concern. And I represent the largest watershed in the Great Lakes. As you well know, you've traveled to our region in the past. And I represent the most tiled watershed in the country. When it rains, the water just rushes into Lake Erie. I live in a mud puddle. It is abundant, it is precious. We have 2 million people and 20 million animals in that watershed. I am looking for more sophisticated management of this watershed, as are our farmers, both large and small. We need help with regenerative soils. We have plenty of data to show, and that's a long story about what is happening, but we have significant nutrient runoff, and we need help in managing this bowl with the added rainfall we are experiencing. It's a real problem, and it's an asset in some ways, but we're not engineered to deal with this new world in which we are living, and I don't want to see our farmers fail. So that is, I just wanted to highlight those issues for you. I don't have a question there, but I'm even tempted to write a Great Lakes title to the new Farm Bill because I'm so worried about what is happening, and our farmers share my view. Number two, I'm very interested and supportive of your efforts to try to connect some of USDA's power to helping our local farmers be able to sell locally, as well as what you're talking about, process more of some of their production to higher value products. I would recommend that your staff look at the Center for Innovative Food Technology, which I think is the greatest launch pad in my little part of the country. They have created, through an organization called the Center for Innovative Food Technology, Willie Salsa, Gertie's barbecue sauce, beer cheese, all kinds of soups, and so much more, and helping bring farmers more income and getting the help they need to move their product to market. I also wanted to mention anything more you could do to use USDA's power, for instance, in the commodities that go out to our food banks and so forth, to help our food bank directors directly contract with farmers. So we know we're going to need cabbage, we know we're going to need potatoes, we know hungry people need food, but help empower our food bank directors to connect to our local farmers, because guess who's the major contributor to our food banks? Local farmers. And many of them live right at the edge. So I think some of USDA's programs can be reconfigured in a way to pay attention to helping restore, because of our concentrated food system, some of the market share that our local farmers have experienced. So I just wanted to mention those concerns. If you want a copy, if you want to comment on any of them, I would welcome them. And also for Congressman Newhouse, I share your concern about labor because I represent huge greenhouses, including in the cities, controlled environmental agriculture facilities, and many nurseries, gigantic, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres. They can't get workers. We must do something. I tried to do that 30 years ago as a member of Congress when George Bush was president, and we could never work it out. I went down to Mexico and everything else. We truly need some pilot programs. Please, if you start them, use my region. We could use them now.
Representative, we have 77 local purchasing agreements with states and local communities to encourage food banks, the purchasing of food bank food and school foods from local purchasing. So that's already being done at USDA by virtue of the resources that you all provided through American Rescue Plan. That's connecting food banks and schools to local purchasing.
Sir, under who is that happening? Who?
It's under market and regulatory. It's MRP. It's several aspects of this, but one of them is the Farm to School program, which you're well aware of. Yes. There's also a local purchasing agreement program. On the Great Lakes,
Mr. Secretary, I'm going to focus on urban areas there also.
No,
not
these
just
are
rural.
focused on urban areas.
Okay.
And then secondly, on the Great Lakes, we have, as you perhaps know, we have the Rural Conservation Partnership Program, RCPP. That's basically, we have put resources into the Great Lakes and will continue, I'm sure, to do so on the conservation
Got a
side.
long way to go.
Well, no question about it, but we're working on it.
Ms. Hinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Secretary Vilsack. It's nice to be with a fellow Iowan here. Appreciate the work that you're doing at USDA to continue to serve American farmers, ranchers, and in our rural communities, which has been obviously a big topic of discussion. Want to start with a topic that's top of mind for so many Iowa farmers, and that is trade. Iowa is the second largest exporter of agricultural commodities, the number over $10 billion every year. And last week, in a hearing with the Senate Finance Committee, U.S. Trade Rep Catherine Tai confirmed that tariff reduction is not a part of the trade agenda for the Biden administration. China and the EU are certainly taking a different approach. So my question is, knowing that you do agree that trade is so important to the health of our industry and Iowa's producers, how can USDA continue to leverage trade promotion programs to make sure that our American agriculture is competitive with some of these foreign, entities and foreign competitors, for lack of a better way of saying that?
We've actually had some success in trade reduction, tariff reductions and an expansion of the safeguard in Japan has led to more beef exports, tariff reductions on corn, wheat, and frozen pork in Vietnam, tariff reductions in the Philippines for corn, pork, and poultry, tariff reductions to expand opportunities and blending requirements for expansion of ethanol in Panama, expanded poultry access in the Middle East, and even cherries access in India. So there's been a concerted effort to try to look at individual opportunities to reduce barriers, which we've done. About $15 billion in new or preserved market access in the last couple of years, which is one of the reasons why we've had record export years. To answer specifically your question, it's about people, presence, and promotion, more trade missions. We now have 7 lined up this year. That's an opportunity for us to go. Our companies go, our farmers go, our ag commissioners and secretaries go to these countries, and they promote U.S. product. We're also working with the U.S. Trade Representative's Office in the Indo-Pacific Framework, economic framework. There's a trade pillar, as you well know, and we are anxious and interested in working with USTR to make sure that that trade pillar ultimately opens up more opportunities, especially in India. So there's a lot of work being done. And I would say the other thing is that we're attempting to make sure that if we have a trade agreement that we actually enforce it, which is why we are taking Mexico and Canada.
That's my next question.
Under
is,
USMCA.
The work that you're doing with bioengineered corn and the challenges with Mexico, because obviously they need to fulfill their end of the deal there. So can you kind of give an update on the work that you're doing in that space to hold them accountable to the deal that they made under USMCA, so they're following through, so that our producers have that market?
Right. It starts with, the market is currently still in play. They're still purchasing the yellow corn. There's an issue with white corn, but there is still 99% of what we sell to them, 96% of what we sell to them is yellow corn. They're still purchasing yellow corn at pretty significant clips because their livestock industry needs it. We have started the consultation process, which is the first step. There are a series of steps under USMCA.
For the challenge process. Yep.
The expectation is that we will go through the entire process and ultimately compel them to reverse this decree, because it goes to the fundamental aspect of our trade policy, which is that we believe in a science-based regulatory system. If you inject culture, if you inject other non-scientific issues into that relationship, you don't have a relationship. And so it's really, really important that we continue to push this. Our Canadian friends, we've now gone to the second consultation on dairy.
And please continue to hold them to those, put their feet to the
the
fire,
intent.
because ultimately that is, that's the livelihoods of Americans on the line, truly. And I would also encourage you to continue to prioritize, and if you'd be willing to follow up with a list of the places where you have found good ground in reducing tariffs. I think if you can share that list with my staff, that would be helpful, so that we know kind of where the work has happened in that space. And I know there's already been a conversation today about avian influenza as well, and you mentioned CCC and the role there in using some of those resources. What do you see as the most major challenges in battling that going forward, both for our producers and with the programs that you have in place?
Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be episodic. I think it's going to be more of a constant threat that we deal with. So I think there are three issues. One, we're working with the industry to make sure that they have biosecurity plans in place and that those plans are implemented. And I think we've seen success from the way things unfolded in 2014 to the way they are unfolding now. There are a lot of backyard problems, which we're going to continue to have, but the commercial operations have done a pretty good job of trying to contain this. So first, biosecurity and implementation. Secondly, taking a look at the design of these facilities in terms of airflow to make sure that we minimize the risk of transition and transmission. And then finally, continued work on vaccines. We're not anywhere near where we need to be, if you will, in terms of, we don't have a solid vaccine today. We have a number of options, a number of opportunities. But even if we got a vaccine, we don't have a commercial producer of that vaccine, and we don't have international acceptance of the notion
That
of
could put our
vaccination.
markets at risk, obviously, for our
Right,
products too.
right. So we have significant work to do, but eventually, hopefully we get to a point where we provide some degree of response.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield back.
Thank you. We have the honor of our full committee ranking member, Mr. Lauro, here. So, Mr. Lauro, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Secretary. And I want to just say a thank you to you for your commitment to this area and what you have been doing as Secretary of the Department of Agriculture. But it is a lifelong commitment to what happens in rural America, what is happening to our children in terms of the food that they eat, their access to the food that they eat, and to others as well. We can't thank you enough, really, for your commitment to these efforts and all that is encompassed, really, in the Department of Agriculture, which is about housing and farmland and food safety and all of these areas. It really is an extraordinary portfolio, and we thank you for the great job that you're doing at it. Let me mention, because it has mentioned when I came in, my apologies for being late. This schedule is crazy. But I heard, I thought that, that there hasn't been any Republican conference on any particular cut to WIC, which is 1.2 million women, infants, and children being jettisoned from the WIC program. But the fact of the matter is that in the absence of a budget that lays out a blueprint from our colleagues, some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, what we do know for a fact, and it has been verified, especially in the last several days, that what we will look to is taking the 2024 government funding and applying 2022 numbers. That has an effect. and it has a serious effect and consequences, as you put forth in the letter that you sent us, telling us where the cuts are. I want to ask a research question first, but I'm going to come back to this because with the I was here, Mr. Secretary, when you came in when the government was shut down. And we talked about food safety, we talked about FSIS, and you talked specifically about the furloughs, who was going to be let go, what was going to happen to the industry, because we inspect on a daily basis. And that is the same thing, in my view, that we're looking at, and I'd like to expound on that. But let me ask you this. The work of USDA, scientists, researchers, touch the lives of all Americans. Farm, field, kitchen, table. The challenges that face agriculture, natural resource conservation are immense. And they can be really addressed through the robust research that you all do and the educational programs. Other countries have surpassed us. U.S. In agricultural research funding. According to the USDA's Economic Research Service, China has become the largest funder of agricultural R&D after 2011. 2015, China was spending more than $10 billion annually on agricultural R&D. That level of spending was roughly twice that of the U.S. In 2015, and nearly quintuple that of China's own R&D spending in 2000. Talk about the funding cuts back to fiscal year 2022, those levels, and the impact on USDA's research, and how that lack of investment keeps us from competing globally.
Well, we have historically underfunded agricultural research as it relates to other areas of research, both in the federal government. We're basically relying on the private sector to do most of that research. The problem with that, Representative DeLauro, is that essentially farmers end up having to pay for that research because when it's obviously when private sector does it, they are entitled to profit from their research. That is what's cost in part increased cost of seed, for example. So as we transition and ask the private sector to do more, we have to understand there's a cost associated with that, and farmers end up bearing that cost. We just recently did a seed report that sort of talked about this. It also has potentially a stifling impact on innovation, which farmers need. We've tried a number of different ways to deal with this. With your help, we got the Foundation for Food and Agriculture, which is a private foundation set up, and they're doing good work. They're leveraging our resources. That's part of the reason why we're doing the Climate Smart commodity effort, is we're going to get a lot of information from that. And there's a leveraging of resources, federal resources, to be able to get the benefit of that effort. But the reality is we've got to get more serious in this country about investing in research. We have to continue to produce more with less. The reality is we're going to have less water. We're going to have more inclement weather. We're going to have more severe storms. We're going to have longer droughts. We're going to have pests and diseases that we don't even know about today because of the changing climate. And we have got to be one step ahead of all of that. The only way you can be one step ahead of it is through research.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And as you said, we try to address that issue in some way, but we have now found that, and if we go backwards, then we will further remove ourselves from competition in terms of, particularly of China. Will there be a second round, Mr. Chair?
There might be a lightning round.
Well, let's go for it. Okay, thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Franklin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here with us today. I represent Florida's 18th District in Central Florida. We're the largest ag district now east of the Mississippi. And within our district, we grow all sorts of things, but we've got 70% of Florida's citrus crop. Last October, Hurricane Ian, as you know, really racked our state, caused over $1 billion of damage to the ag industry, according to University of Florida estimates. 90% of our citrus crop was destroyed. There's not much you can do with the 10% remaining. It's not even cost effective to pick a lot of the fruit that is remaining. You were down in our district a couple of weeks ago in Bartow, and I appreciate you spending time down there. Back following Hurricane Irma in 2018, Congress gave USDA the authority to issue block grants to states to assist with those recovery efforts. And the growers, many of the growers I've spoken with, absolutely cite that program with their ability to save their groves and get back on their feet again. 3 weeks ago, we had USDA Inspector General Fong here. I asked her the question about the efficacy of those programs. She said that, historically, those have been very successful in helping folks get money quickly to get back on their feet again. Back in December, we passed, the huge omnibus bill. Included among that, Congress appropriated $3.7 billion to extend USDA's emergency relief program to assist producers who experienced losses in 2022. Not crop insurance. I mean, obviously, that's a different program, a different pot of money. Unfortunately, in this omnibus bill, there was no language specifically authorizing the use of those block grants. Don't know if that was just an oversight in trying to get that thing crafted and out the door or not, but we worked with your staff a couple of months ago trying to figure out if there was, how we could interpret the language to see if it could be construed that way. It wasn't ultimately. We didn't think so. So we proceeded then to create a bill, the Block Grant Assistance Program Act of 2023. I've got 27 of 28 members of our Florida delegation on that. Both of our senators have a companion bill in the Senate. We're trying to get that pushed through. Ag Committee Chairman Thompson is supportive of it. We've just got a lot of other initiatives we're trying to get out the door. But, my question, there actually is a question here. If Congress gives USDA the authority, will you commit to working with our producers to get that block grant program up and going?
Sure.
Okay, we're hoping we can get that done soon. Absent that, and I've learned quickly enough here, it's hard to get things done a lot of times, but when I talked to Undersecretary Bonney back in January, and we were trying to figure out if there was language there, he said, we'll do what we can, and if there are creative other ways, we'll try to find ways to find some money to assist. Could you comment on what those might be in absence of getting that language?
I think you got a bigger problem.
Okay.
And the problem is that the first iteration of disaster assistance, ad hoc disaster assistance for 20 and 21 was $10 billion. This is $3.3 billion. So I think you're going to find that there's a significant delta between the demand and the need and the amount of money that's been appropriated. So the reality is it's not likely to make any farmer whole in the sense of providing assistance and help.
Right.
We have looked at ways in which we can try to get disaster assistance out more quickly. That's why we established a pre-filled application process for farmers with the ERP program. We ended up saving farmers about 1 million hours of time, and we got the checks out in the mail within 2 weeks of the applications being submitted. So that's the goal here, is to try to get the resources out as quickly as possible and use all the information that we have available to us to make it easy on the farmer.
So how much of that 3.7 that was appropriated has actually gone out the door?
Well, we're still in the process of completing the process on the ERP for 20 and 21. We have until June, folks have the ability to submit information. We haven't been able to put out the resources for 22 because we haven't fully completed collection of the crop insurance information and NAP information from 2022. We need that in order to pre-fill the application, in order to be able to get people resources as quickly as possible. The previous process, basically, there was months of time between the time the farmer would apply and the time they got the money. We're condensing it into weeks.
Okay, well, we're now 6 months past the storm, and then
You can't issue the checks to all of the farmers, not just the Florida farmers, but the farmers in the West who have had drought, who have had smoke damage. I mean, there's a lot of people who have suffered serious problems, which is why we're concerned that the $3 billion is not going to be able to meet all of the demand.
well, a lot of concern my folks have too, though, is, and you were, in your opening testimony, you were talking about the need for more employees. The feedback I'm hearing from our folks is you don't have the folks in your offices that were there prior to COVID. And I don't know if we got folks still teleworking or what the situation is, but we often have phones that go unanswered because the people who they used to call aren't there answering the phones anymore.
Let's be clear about this. Because I'm the first secretary ever to come back to this job, I knew how many people work for the Department of Agriculture when I left, and I know how many people work for the department when I came back. There were 6,500 fewer people working for the department when I came back. So we are in the process of trying to rebuild the workforce, number one. Number two, we track the work that's being done. Loans are being, there hasn't been a drop-off in terms of the service to folks. In fact, I think our people at the FSA offices have done a remarkable job getting all of those disaster relief assistance out, getting the loans out, getting the CRP efforts out. They've really stepped up. And I'm happy, if you want to give me a specific office, I'm happy to have our folks take a look at that particular office. Happy to do that.
we can do that, because that's honestly not the feedback I'm receiving. But, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Letlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. And bear with me as I get through this timeline, because I have serious concerns with the implementation of the ERP as it relates to on-farm stored commodities. Hurricanes and extreme weather dealt a hard blow to Louisiana farmers in 20 and 21. Farm families in my district were deeply impacted as torrential rains, rising waters, and hurricane-force winds destroyed harvested crops and on-farm storage. In September 21, Congress passed a continuing resolution and emergency assistance measure that provided relief to farmers for losses sustained in 20 and 21. This language specifically directed the USDA to cover losses associated with on-farm stored commodities. Then in May 22, USDA finally issued a notice of funding availability and rules for Phase 1 of the ERP. However, this program was based on a plus-up of crop insurance indemnities for crops lost in the field. Because of Louisiana's growing season, several crops like rice and soybeans had already been harvested and damaged in on-farm storage. They were no longer insurable under the federal crop insurance program, and on-farm stored commodities was specifically spelled out in statutory directive for this reason. Members of Congress, producers, and stakeholders were given firm assurance that those losses would be covered in the broader Phase 2 of ERP to assess crop-by-crop losses that were more complicated or required additional documentation. And on January 11th, 23, the USDA released the final rule for ERP Phase 2. Unfortunately, there appears to be no provision for on-farm stored commodity losses, and I have grave concerns that USDA is seeking to roll these losses with other losses that USDA intends to measure from tax records. I do not believe this is a viable substitute for my producers and falls well short of the congressional directive given in the fiscal year 22 continuing resolution and emergency assistance. I sent a letter to you on January 25th and 23 addressing this exact issue. It was not until this week, just a day before you were set to testify today, that my office received a response. This response confirmed my concerns, Mr. Secretary, that every specific direction Congress gave USDA on what should be covered in the disaster relief funding, USDA has taken a one-size-fits-all approach, lumping their coverage of these specific issues into a Schedule F reporting model. My question is this: does USDA believe they have met Congress's intent through ERP? And when will we see direct relief to those who suffered losses to on-farm storage for 20 and 21?
We believe we have, Congresswoman, and as I indicated in response to Congressman Franklin's question, we are in this process of still collecting information from people who did not have crop insurance, didn't have NAP coverage. These are folks who are really on the edge. They have until June to submit information. Once we get that information and the applications, we'll be able to determine how much of the remaining resources are going to be distributed. There may very well be a third round of ERP for 20 and 21. And we're more than happy to take a look at the storage issue. I'll take that back to our team and ask them to take a look at that.
Do you believe that the Schedule F is a comprehensive tool?
Well, the challenge here is we're moving from a production model, which basically focuses on large-scale producing operations, to a revenue model, which is more aligned for assisting small and mid-sized operations that don't have crop insurance, that don't have the capacity to have NIP. These are very, very small producers that are on the edge. So we're asking for information that's not dissimilar to what we asked for with adjusted gross income, so that we can determine whether or not limitations are applied. So this is not it's not an onerous request that we're making. It's a revenue focus as opposed to a production focus. And the reason it's a revenue focus is we think it will help those small and mid-sized producers more efficiently and more effectively with disaster assistance.
All right. Thank you. I yield back my remaining time to the chairman.
Thank you, and thank you for getting back. But we're going to have to go into a final round. I believe they're on the last amendment debate right now, so I think we're going to have enough to have 2 minutes per person. And if we can keep to that, and I apologize, Mr. Secretary, that that we're going to have to limit the time to 2 minutes for this last round. I'll recognize myself first. Just following up on one of Mr. Franklin's questions about the. This idea of remote work and telework. I mean, the budget includes $47 million to modernize the buildings here, but my understanding is that you kind of hear a pin drop in them, that there just aren't a whole lot of employees centrally, and you make the point that, look, as long as productivity is the same, You know, we live in a different world. I mean, that might be the model for the future. But why will it be necessary to do this if we actually have very few workers physically in these facilities?
The modernization we're talking about is basically moving to a cloud-based system. It's essentially stepping up our technology capacities. I asked, when I got this job first, I asked it to send an email to all of our employees. I was told I couldn't do that. I had to send 17 emails because we had 17 systems. Mr. Chairman, we're still working on this,
Wow.
okay? And it's as frustrating to me as I'm sure it is to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely, no question about it. Now, your budget does request to hire 4,700 new employees. What % of those would be remote employees or telework employees, do you know?
Well, those folks would all be subject to the telework policy that we've established. So in a sense, I guess all of them in that sense. But the reality is many of those people that we're asking to be hired are NRCS folks, and NRCS folks are on the ground. They're working out on the field. We have a huge backlog, which we need more. We have over 100,000 applications for conservation that we need to address. We need more people.
Great, no, thank you very much. And finally, with regards to the SNAP program, I asked you about the WIC program. There is no cost share for the states in the SNAP program, right? I mean, there's cost share on administrative, but not on the benefit itself, is that right?
That's correct.
So in contrast to Medicaid, which is important, it's health care, you know, the states in traditional Medicaid have an average 44% cost share. The FMAP is 56% average. Again, I think one of the ways that we can solve some of our budget crisis is actually have the states start paying part of their fair share for these programs that they think are so important, benefits the citizens in their state. And if we apply an FMAP based on the economic FMAP, just like we have for Medicaid, it would not disadvantage those states that are poor. Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. I know it's a lightning round, but Mr. Secretary, there were questions about priorities and the climate change issue and equity were raised. Why are those priorities? I know that nearly 80% of the western region experienced drought, wildfires, 7.6 million acres of forest land. We've had flooding, record snow, all of that. Those areas across the country have been devastated. And of course, the scientists tell us that it's related to climate change. Can you tell us why it's so important that we put the climate efforts into the Department of Agriculture? What does that mean to everyday Americans? And the other question is, what does it mean to everyday Americans? Why should equity in the Department of Agriculture be put forth as a priority as the department has done?
Climate is directly related to food security, and food security is directly related to national security. If we have people who are fed, we've got a stronger democracy. And if we can't produce our own food, then we have to rely on others. We're fortunate today we don't have to do that. We're not China that has to rely on us for their food. So I think it has to do with national security and food security. In terms of equity, you know, clearly we've had a history at USDA, as you well know, but it's also about making sure that we reduce the number of program complaints and EEOC complaints, which are time-consuming and expensive. It's about a fairer, better place to work. It's about recruiting people and retaining a workforce. One of the challenges we have is retaining our workforce. It's about a workforce that reflects the diversity of America that we serve. So there are a multitude of reasons why this is an important issue for us, whether it's our history, whether it's our recruiting efforts, or whether it's just basically trying to be a better steward of the resources so that we're not paying resources out because somebody's been discriminated against in terms of our programs.
Thank you. I think my time has expired.
Thank you very much. Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, while I was Ag Director, I took several trade missions, accompanied the governor primarily to the Pacific Rim. Trade is very important in the state of Washington, and I've been working to bolster the market access programs and other things. Talk about the Indo-Pacific framework, which is just a framework truly based on a handshake. Shouldn't the administration and Congress be more focused on reauthorizing TPA, Trade Promotion Authority?
Well, I'm not sure. Has there been a bill proposed by a member of Congress that's been filed? I don't know if there has.
But just that question, wouldn't that be a more effective
Well, the Trade Promotion Authority, well, obviously, Trade Promotion Authority is a precondition to getting any trade agreement through. But the reality is, the problem in America today is that there are not enough Americans who trust trade. It may very well be that in the agricultural space, people understand the importance of trade because we've enjoyed a surplus for many, many years. But the reality is that in many other industries, that's not the perception of trade. So I think we have to rebuild the trust in trade, and the way we do that, in part, is by educating people about the importance of it and the jobs that are created from it, and also making sure that when we do have a trade agreement, we enforce it.
Thank you. And then real quickly, I'm really concerned about the continued availability of crop protection tools. Could you, I'm asking you to commit to working with Congress and regulators to truly stand by sound science so that we can make sure that as federal regulators, we make sure states don't undercut that, rely on contradictory science that perhaps issues conflicting label requirements.
We make every effort in our relationship with EPA, to focus on sound science. That's sort of our pole star.
I heard you say that before, but I appreciate that commitment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. DeLauro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick point. If we want to increase our revenues and save ourselves some money, what we ought to do is to make sure that we are enforcing our tax laws when it comes to corporations who pay no taxes, instead of going after critical issues that face the American people every day, and the issue of the increase of hunger in the United States. Mr. Secretary, just overall, I think it's been established that where some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to go is to cut about 22% of government funding. Are there cuts that we haven't touched on that would affect your department, and what does that mean? Anything that you would like to discuss overall in that area?
Well, we have a serious problem with rental assistance in rural places. The problem we have is a system that basically says we lend money to somebody for a multifamily operation. They commit to a certain percentage of that unit, of those units, to be rent-assisted units. When they pay off the mortgage, those rent assistance units are no longer rent assistance units. Rents go up. We have a voucher program, but the problem is the voucher program only anticipates about 30 projects coming offline. We have about 80 now, and that's just going to accelerate. So we are losing rental assistance units. If you reduce the budget even further, you're talking about 40,000 rental units that could potentially be lost. That's 40,000 families or individuals who are going to lose their home. And I don't know where those people go. So that is a challenge, which is why in our budget we're requesting the decoupling of the mortgage loan and the rental assistance, or creating some mechanism by which we preserve those rental assistance units.
I might add that what we did with the 2023 budget was the fact that it was Democrats and Republicans who came together, made investments in increasing some of these areas. That's what we have to continue to fight for, and look forward to working with you on those issues. Thank you. Yield back.
Ms. Henson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Real quick follow-up on Mr. Newhouse's question about some of these crop protection tools. Obviously, we've seen the EPA restrict access to more than a dozen of those. Your Office of Pest Management is supposed to be pushing back, obviously, with producer feedback, and I know you don't want to tell the EPA how to do their job, but I also think it bears taking a look at. Do you think that EPA is taking your feedback into consideration to a sufficient degree? Do you think they are interested in hearing from you about crop protection tools? What's the relationship there like?
I think the relationship with this EPA is as good as it's ever been in the time I've been secretary. We've got an administrator who's open to listening to and being concerned about the concerns of farmers. We do provide a lot of information. Sometimes our information is taken, sometimes it's not. But it would be sort of like me telling you, can you tell the Senate what to do? I've watched you all work.
We try.
You try, exactly.
Valiantly try.
You try. That's the point. You try. You do the best you can. After EPA makes a decision, our job that I see at USDA is then to figure out ways in which we can help farmers comply with whatever the conditions are. If we can use resources or tools or technical assistance, how do we help the farmer?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield back.
Ms. Underwood.
The Inflation Reduction Act provided billions of dollars in funding to expand USDA programs that support farmers as they implement conservation practices that benefit both their farms and our climate. And I hear frequently from farmers across northern Illinois who would like to participate in these programs, but because of overburdened USDA state and local offices, they're struggling to navigate the process. USDA's fiscal year 24 budget requests an additional funding for conservation technical assistance to address these bottlenecks. However, Republican budget proposals would drastically cut funding for the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Mr. Secretary, what impact would these proposed budget cuts have on farmers' access to USDA programs and technical assistance?
In our view, 84,000 farmers would not have the technical assistance they need to proceed to embrace the conservation practices they know they need.
84,000 is a big number. And given that farmers are increasingly facing challenging weather conditions from flooding to drought and other natural disasters, it's critical that we reject these proposed cuts and support our farmers who are on the front lines of our climate crisis. Thank you, Secretary Vilsack, for being here today. I yield back.
Ms. Kaptur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Vilsack, I just want to circle back and invite someone from your staff by Zoom or by physically coming out to my region in Ohio to observe how the senior and the WIC nutrition programs operate, and to see how federal dollars actually go back into the pockets of local farmers as well as provide food for our seniors, locally produced, and for our WIC recipients. This program is so successful. We have over 130 farmers now who use EBT. We've restored our farmers market. Free enterprise is starting to really be restored for our local farmers. And if those that people don't want to come down to the farmers market, then they can sell, on their own farmstead. But I really think we need something to happen at USDA to understand the impact of what this program can do to help family farmers at the local level. So I just wanted to restate that and also say on the contracting by our food banks with local farmers, that's another way that we can really make a difference with local farmers and connect. Number two, very quickly on trade. I'm listening to all the discussion about trade. There's a book, Dreamland by Sam Quinones, when the Mexican white corn market disappeared after that horrible agreement was signed in 1993. The Mexican white corn market disappeared. And what was it replaced by? Heroin. And that has been the chief commodity as it grew every decade. Something has to happen with the Mexican white corn market. And finally, can you tell us anything about biofuels? Is it true that John Deere has a tractor that now operates on 100% ethanol? Is that true?
I don't know if that's true, but what I can tell you is that the future of biofuels is a pretty important one because there's a sustainable aviation fuel effort underway in this administration to provide 36 billion gallons of aviation fuel, which our airline industry is desperately requesting. It's a new industry. It's one of these ways of creating more new and better markets and income sources for farmers.
Mr. Secretary, I hope you could put me in touch with who those people are. I'm ranking on the Energy Committee here. I'm very interested in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have to tell the committee, I made a rookie mistake. They were on the last amendment about 15 minutes ago, but I forgot about the magic minute. The majority leader's still talking on the floor, but votes are imminent. So we could have had a couple of extra minutes in that second round. But Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today. Thank you for the job you do helping Americans' farmers. I think our discussion touched on many important issues that resonate with our nation's producers and our constituents across rural America. While you and I disagree on some issues, I look forward to working with you as we move through our fiscal year 24 process. As a reminder, if members would like to submit questions for the record, please submit those to the subcommittee staff within 7 days